Narrowing the search. Former Vice President Joe Biden is drawing closer to naming his running mate for the 2020 election. Fight for the unborn. New developments in Georgia's heartbeat bill signed by Republican Governor Brian Kemp. Message of mercy. An update on the situation in the East African country of Mozambique, less than 1 year after a visit from Pope Francis. And funds for the faithful. Analysis of the money Catholic organizations received from the federal Paycheck Protection Program. On EWTN News Nightly for Tuesday, July 14th, 2020. Good evening and thanks for joining us tonight. I'm Tracy Sable. The spotlight in the battle against COVID-19 moves to Louisiana. That is where Vice President Mike Pence is meeting tonight with the state's governor. They are talking with health officials about opening up higher education this fall and the future of college sports. All this as Louisiana has seen a spike in coronavirus cases and hospitalizations. White House correspondent Owen Jensen reports. Owen?
Tracy, Vice President Mike Pence, who also heads up the White House coronavirus task force, went to another virus battlefield today, this time the state of Louisiana, where anyone age 8 or over now has to wear a mask. Vice President Mike Pence in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, speaking at the State Emergency Operations Center.
I'm proud to report that we're moving forward aggressively at warp speed on the development of a vaccine.
Like other states, the virus battle in Louisiana remains ongoing, uncertain, and unending.
We bent the curve, and we're going to do it again. This is a serious time with rising cases across Louisiana and all across the Sun Belt.
Meanwhile, how to start school. One superintendent calling the current situation the biggest adaptive challenge in the history of public education.
I know how important school is for our young people.
But in San Diego, online only for now.
This is an important time for us to make smart decisions for our students and for our communities. We've got to make smart plans, and we have to keep our community safe.
Task force members recently told EWTN News Nightly it's important to reopen schools.
We've got to get our kids back to school. In the same way we have to get back to work, we got to get back to school, we have to get back to worship, and we have to get back to health care. And there are ways that we can do it safely.
And the learning about coronavirus continues every day.
And there's a difference between infection and disease. And so when we talk about the spectrum of disease, we think children get infected but have less disease. And there's less disease the younger you are.
Finally, a friendly reminder from the IRS. Remember when the pandemic forced the deadline to move from April 15th to July 15th? Well, tomorrow's July 15th, and this time it's not being postponed. But you can request an automatic extension to file. The Vice President also visited LSU, Louisiana State University. He spoke at a roundtable of education officials, and he told them K through 12 schools and higher ed schools need to reopen to get the country going again. And the coach was there also, the football coach, Coach O, and he said America and the economy need football, and his team is ready to go. Tracy?
White House correspondent Owen Jensen reporting for us tonight. Thank you so much, Owen. Well, House lawmakers questioned experts today on how to prepare for a COVID-19 vaccine.
Expert advisors at the Centers for Disease Control are already thinking about these questions around prioritization in terms of how we might think about where the first doses, when we know we won't have nearly enough to meet demand, but where those first doses can go.
Congresswoman Carolyn Maloney is asking the Department of Health and Human Services for copies of contracts that they have with private vaccine developers, in part to ensure vaccine affordability for all Americans. Early this morning, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled executions of prisoners on death row in the United States can resume for the first time in 17 years. 47-year-old Daniel Lee was killed by lethal injection today for the 1996 murder of an Arkansas family, even after relatives of Lee's victims tried to stop the execution. Yesterday, an Indiana judge halted executions over concerns about the lethal injection method. But after this morning's decision by the Supreme Court, 2 more executions have been scheduled for later this week. Pope Francis has said the death penalty is inadmissible because it is an attack on the dignity of the person. With only 120 days to the 2020 presidential election, Democratic presidential candidate Joe Biden is deep into his search for a running mate. The 77-year-old says that he wants someone who is ready to assume the presidency. Capitol Hill correspondent Eric Rosales reports. Eric?
Well, Tracy, to say Joe Biden's team is busy right now is an understatement. They're narrowing the list of potential VP candidates, and they are going through multiple interviews and also collecting a lot of sensitive data and materials of the top contenders.
I pick a woman to be vice president. There are a number of women who are qualified to be president tomorrow.
Since Joe Biden, a Catholic, made his pledge at a debate in March, speculation has swirled around prominent contenders. The New York Times profiling 13 women who are likely on the list, including Atlanta Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms, and she's not ruling it out.
I am a leader with proven leadership. That being said, this decision will be left up to Vice President Biden.
And Senator Tammy Duckworth, an Iraq War combat veteran, wife and mother. She made history in 2018 when her newborn daughter became the first baby allowed on the Senate floor.
Facing war hero Tammy Duckworth as Joe Biden's running mate.
The Democratic Political Action Committee, Vote Vets, is campaigning for her to be selected. Joe Biden and the women vying to join his presidential ticket continue to advocate for the Democratic Party platform. It specifically supports abortion and states, quote, "We will continue to stand up to Republican efforts to defund Planned Parenthood." And this week, Senator Kamala Harris appears to be rising to the top of Biden's list, outlining her plans for police reform.
There's a movement at play here, and that movement did not just start a few weeks ago.
And actively campaigning for Joe Biden.
I think Kamala Harris is probably a good pick.
Bob Heckman worked on John McCain's presidential campaign when Sarah Palin joined the ticket, and he tells me Joe Biden could still surprise everyone too.
Picking a dark horse is a possibility, but I do think for him it has to be somebody that people say, oh yeah, you know, she has the qualifications, she's capable of doing it.
It's important to note that Joe Biden did reinforce his pro-abortion stance by criticizing the decision of the Supreme Court last week in the Little Sisters of the Poor case. Now, Biden did say that he would reinstate pro-abortion policy if he makes it to the White House. He is expected to pick his running mate August 1st. Tracy?
Okay, thank you so much, Eric. Correspondent Eric Rosales reporting from Capitol Hill. U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo says China's claims to islands and reefs in the South China Sea are, quote, illegal. And Japanese officials say they support the U.S.'s rejection of China's claims. Japan's chief cabinet secretary praised the move by the U.S. as a, quote, unwavering commitment to peace and stability. China's Navy has been building military bases on artificial islands for years. A fund set up by India's prime minister to fight the coronavirus pandemic is under scrutiny for not disclosing donors or payments. Narendra Modi created the fund PM Cares back in March, and since then, ordinary citizens, Bollywood stars, and foreign companies have donated over $1 billion to the fund. Modi's office says the fund is not a public authority. First, Pope Francis and now the European Union is also condemning Turkey's decision to convert the former historical Hagia Sophia from a museum into a mosque. Turkey's foreign minister is rejecting the condemnation, saying converting it back into a mosque is an issue of national sovereignty. The 6th century Greek Orthodox cathedral has been a museum for 86 years. On Sunday, the Holy Father said he was, quote, deeply pained by the decision. Last September, Pope Francis visited Mozambique. His theme was hope, peace, and reconciliation. But less than a year later, difficulties remain in the East African country. In northern Mozambique, nearly 200,000 people have been displaced. They were escaping violent attacks by Islamic extremists. And the central part of the country is still recovering from a cyclone that hit last year. The storm damaged almost the entire region and forced more than 1,500 families into refugee camps. Joining us now from Rome is Mauro Garofalo, International Relations Officer for the community of Sant'Egidio, which does a lot of work in Mozambique. Mauro, so good to see you again.
It's always a pleasure to be with you.
Well, Mauro, it sounds like things aren't going so well in Mozambique, unfortunately. What more can you tell us, and is there any hope that things will improve?
We hope so, but so far there is an ongoing crisis on North Mozambique because there are attacks from terrorist group that are causing a lot of distress and pain among the population. This is a serious threat to the country. This is something that was sort of unexpected, and we have to react and to face this new emergency. So yes, unfortunately, the effects on the population are very serious.
Can you refresh our memory about the Pope's visit there, and what were some of the highlights during that trip?
That visit was an historic moment for the long-lasting reconciliation process for the country. It was a visit focused on the development of the country, but also on national reconciliation. And it was a visit widely attended by all the population. It was a sign of peace, a sign of hope, a country that has reached peace after a long process. And in Sant'Egidio, we are witness of this process because it started exactly 30 years ago in our headquarters. We just celebrated the 30th anniversary of the beginning of the process.
Do you think the Pope's trip will have any long-term benefits there?
I'm sure of this. Every visit of the Pope, especially in Africa, has a long-lasting effects. We saw this in many other countries. I think that Mozambique is a vastly majority Christian country, and it is already very good in terms of reconciliation, dialogue among religions, and also denomination. So I hope the positive effect will last for a long, long time.
Yeah. The coronavirus pandemic has hit everyone very hard. Has your group been able to help those in Mozambique during the pandemic?
Absolutely, also because we have a wide web of laboratories and healthcare centers all over the country. And we modified a little bit the priorities, enabling them to work on COVID, to test people. So it was a way to strengthen the national healthcare system, and it very much needed. And also all our people in Mozambique, all our members, we are talking about some thousands of people, observe strict rules of social distancing, and they teach how to do so. So for us, it's a serious challenge, and we are trying to be serious in answering that.
Maura, thank you so much for joining us today and speaking with us, and thank you for what you do. Maura Garofalo, International Relations Officer for the community of Sant'Egidio. Thank you again.
Thank you so much.
Coming up, a setback for a pro-life bill signed last year by Georgia's governor. We'll explain. Plus, a closer look at the federal funds received by Catholic organizations during the coronavirus crisis. A U.S. federal judge has suspended a rule requiring women to visit a hospital, clinic, or medical office to receive an abortion pill during the COVID-19 pandemic. The ruling says the measure is a, quote, substantial obstacle to patients seeking an abortion. Pro-lifers said the provision was reasonable and necessary to protect women. And in Georgia, a federal judge has permanently blocked one of the state's pro-life bills. Republican Governor Brian Kemp signed a measure last year to ban abortion once a baby's heartbeat is detected. Abortion groups filed a lawsuit, and the judge ruled the proposal violates the U.S. Constitution. Governor Kemp says he will appeal. Following an Associated Press report saying the government gave, quote, special consideration to faith-based groups in the federal Paycheck Protection Program, the U.S. bishops are defending its use by Catholic parishes and other Catholic organizations. Archbishop Paul Coakley, chairman of the USCCB Committee on Domestic Justice and Human Development, writes in part, quote, the Paycheck Protection Program was designed to protect the jobs of Americans from all walks of life, regardless of whether they work for profit or nonprofit employers, faith-based or secular groups. Joining me now on Skype is Andrew Robison, president of Petrus Development, which has helped more than 100 Catholic ministries in their fundraising efforts. Andrew, welcome back to the show. Good to see you.
Thanks, Tracy. My pleasure to be here.
Andrew, let's talk about the Paycheck Protection Program, or PPP, that is, and who's eligible.
Sure, absolutely. So the intent of the Payroll Protection Program, when it was rolled out back in March, I believe, was to keep American workers employed. And so, this this article by the AP that says that churches and faith-based organizations were given preferential treatment I just don't get it, because the Catholic Church, they claim that $1.4 billion went to the Catholic Church, which on the surface may raise some concern for some people. But what non-Catholics and many Catholics don't understand is that the Catholic Church is actually a collection of 25,000 unique organizations. So there's over 17,000 Catholic parishes, over 600 hospitals, over 6,000 schools and universities, and over 1,000 nonprofits in the country that employ American workers to do all sorts of offer all sorts of services for the community and for our society. And I think that to claim that the church was given preferential treatment, I think it's just wrong.
Yeah, Andrew, can you talk about who is covered under the umbrella of Catholic organizations, and maybe what are some of the things that money was used for?
Yeah, absolutely. So Catholic organizations in general would qualify. You'd be looking at Catholic parishes, hospitals, schools, both elementary and secondary, colleges, nonprofit organizations. Many of them are considered Catholic organizations. And the payroll protection money was used specifically for payroll, benefits, rent, and utilities. So the intent of it was to keep workers, American workers, employed. And I think that it did just that. You know, the Catholic Church employs over 1 million workers, and as high as 2.5 million when you look at some estimates, including part-time and full-time. They invest over $100 billion in payroll, in goods and services, in direct aid for food, shelter, and clothing for the poor. And so I think that the money that came from the stimulus kept workers working at those institutions so they could keep those services going, which I think is important for Catholics, and I think it's important for the country as well.
Well, the AP raises the issue of preferential treatment for faith-based groups. That is, I'm curious, what's your reaction to that statement?
Yeah, so again, I just don't get it. Archbishop Coakley said in his statement that you read earlier that the payroll protection program was for nonprofits and for-profits, regardless of their mission. And so I think when you look at how many employees the Catholic Church employs, like I said, between 1 and 2.5 million. The fact that over 25,000 organizations, many of which are very small organizations, implying just a handful of people to run entire parishes and nonprofits, I think that it accomplished exactly what it did in keeping those American workers employed and doing good work for the church and for the country.
Well, Andrew, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate your insight. Andrew Robinson, President of Petrus Development, thank you again.
Absolutely. God bless.
Well, across the country, debate over controversial monuments continues. Confederate statues, many standing for over 100 years, are now coming down. At the same time, we are seeing the vandalism of some religious symbols. Correspondent Mark Irons reports.
Statues of Robert E. Lee, Jefferson Davis, and Stonewall Jackson are among the Confederate monuments being removed across the country.
I think it's a healthy debate to be having, to sort of think about the monuments.
Dr. Stephen West, a history professor at the Catholic University of America, is a Civil War expert. He says Confederate leaders were explicit about the reasons they rebelled against the U.S.
So if you listen to the Confederates themselves, they're absolutely clear. It's about slavery.
Statues of Confederate President Jefferson Davis have come down in places like Kentucky and Virginia.
Jefferson Davis says that slavery is ordained by God Almighty and sanctioned by the Bible.
The controversy over monument removals goes beyond Confederate symbols. Protesters tried to topple a statue of Andrew Jackson in front of the White House. The 7th president implemented policies to remove Native Americans from their land. Even statues of Abraham Lincoln have sparked anger in places like Boston and D.C., where an 1876 statue memorializes the president's Emancipation Proclamation to free slaves.
The federal government has now placed fencing around this monument after critics called for its removal. They say it shows a lack of equality with a freed slave on his knees beneath the standing President Lincoln. But those in favor of keeping it say it was funded by former slaves after the Civil War.
Dr. West believes public debate and removal of controversial statues is acceptable, but he's opposed to their destruction by mobs. Around the country, statues of other historical figures have come down as well, including statues of Christopher Columbus and St. Junipero Serra. Father James Caroli is the rector of Cathedral Prep School and Seminary in Queens, New York. the last high school seminary in the country. Last week, a statue of the Virgin Mary was vandalized outside the school.
I think it shows the state that we are in as a country.
And over the weekend in Boston, a statue of Mary was burned.
We are in a very divisive time in our country. And when we focus upon our differences, it will certainly lead to ignorance and hatred.
Father Caroli says there is no reason to believe motivations for destroying Confederate statues and the Virgin Mary are the same or every incident is connected. He does hope religious symbols will be seen as more than historical.
These statues are used as an instrument to help people have an encounter with God.
In Washington, Mark Irons, EWTN News Nightly.
Up next, analysis of why Catholic schools should receive funding from the federal government during the COVID-19 pandemic. We continue our look at the devastating financial blow the COVID-19 pandemic has had on Catholic institutions and possible solutions to help those facing economic hardships. Schools in particular have been hard hit. As we reported last week, the Archdiocese of New York has announced 20 schools will be unable to reopen and 3 schools will merge. In a statement, Superintendent of Schools Michael Deegan says, "I have been a Catholic school educator for more than 40 years and could never have imagined the grave impact this pandemic has had on our schools." Joining me now by Skype is Kathleen Porter McGee. She is Superintendent of Partnership Schools, a network of 9 urban Catholic schools in New York and Cleveland. Kathleen, welcome to the show. Great to have you.
Thanks for having me, Tracy. I'm glad to be here.
Well, as we mentioned, the Archdiocese of New York announced last week that it's closing 20 of its schools due to the COVID-19 pandemic. How would receiving federal relief funds help these schools?
It would be an enormous help. I think Catholic schools, even more so than public charter schools or traditional public schools, are facing really an existential economic crisis thanks to COVID-19. So when the government shut down, closed all schools, including Catholic schools, many Catholic schools, many private schools nationwide lost the tuition revenue that they rely on in order to keep their doors open. Most Catholic schools are operating on a shoestring budget to begin with. And when you lose tuition revenue, it means you're losing your lifeline. And so federal aid would really be a way to keep Catholic schools, to get them through the worst of this crisis so that they can continue to serve their students well after it's over.
Kathleen, what's stopping Catholic and private schools from receiving these funds?
Honestly, I feel like it's politics more than anything else. The fight over whether public funding should go to private schools in general and Catholic schools in particular is a fight as old as Catholic schools are. The reason Catholic schools exist today is because of a fight over who should control the values that are taught in schools in general. And there has been a tension between those who believe that public schools should be non-sectarian, which initially just frankly meant non-Catholic, and people who really believe that parents should be able to choose the values that they want their children educated in. And so that fight is as old as time, and it continues today. So people are saying there should be no federal money provided to Catholic schools, even in the face of this government-mandated shutdown and even in the face of this pandemic. I do think there is a difference, or there should be a difference, in how we look at this debate today in the world of COVID and how we look at it in terms of vouchers and tax credits. But I think it's hard for people to separate the current crisis and emergency from the longstanding debate over aid to private schools.
Yeah, we know that more than half of the schools that are closing in New York are located in disadvantaged areas. What type of impact could those closures have on the students and their families?
It's going to be devastating. Catholic schools, so I have the privilege of serving Catholic schools in both Cleveland and New York. 7 of the schools that we manage and operate are in New York City, 4 are in Harlem and 3 in the South Bronx. They serve some of the most economically disadvantaged neighborhoods in the country. And they are really beacons of hope and opportunity, and they have been for as many as 164 years. And so the fact that these are the Catholic schools we are losing, it's going to have a devastating impact on the communities. And we know this, not just from anecdote, but actually from research. There was one study that was published called Lost Classrooms, Lost Communities, which studied what happened to neighborhoods in Chicago when urban Catholic schools closed. And they found that, sure, maybe a charter school or a public school could fill the academic void, but nothing was able to fill the community void. Catholic schools are community institutions. They lift communities and families and students and neighborhoods out of poverty. And what they found in this particular study was that when a Catholic school left, crime increased, disorder increased. And so I think we're being really short-sighted if we do not find a way to provide crisis emergency relief to Catholic schools. I think the impact is going to be felt for decades to come.
Well, Kathleen, thank you so much for coming on and talking with us. We really appreciate it. Kathleen Porter-McGee, Superintendent of Partnership Schools. Thank you again.
Thank you.
And we thank you for watching tonight. For the entire EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Tracy Sable. Good night and God bless.